she sued this company. I'm not going to call any names, but the initials are BFI. They were headquartered in Texas, and she said, Bob, this community has come to me, and it's a suburban, middle-class community of homeowners in Houston. And so this company wants to put this sanitary landfill in the middle of this community. And I said, yes, and you should know that there's nothing sanitary about a landfill. This is a garbage dump. You can call it whatever you want to call it. And the name of the landfill was Whispering Pines Sanitary Landfill. And so the idea was to, this is 1979 when she filed this lawsuit, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management. This was the first lawsuit that used the civil rights laws to challenge environmental discrimination. And so this is, you know, this is like, there was no roadmap. And I had 10 graduate students in my research methods class, and we started to collect this data and started my way on the road to doing this work. And the issue then was very clear, is that this was a landfill that was put in the middle of this predominantly black community of homeowners. And the street that which the landfill was located on did not have sidewalks. The truck was running up and down the road, kids walking up and down the road. You know, these are elementary schools. There were 7 schools that was within a 1-mile radius of this landfill. And the fact that it was so close to the schools is that I'm standing on the 50-yard line, and I took a picture of the landfill. And if I have that laser pointer, yes. This is a 50-yard line, and this is a landfill mound rising, you know, above the trees. Now, this is Houston, Texas, and it gets hot in Houston, some people say. No air conditioning. The windows are up at the schools. It's hell. It's hell. If you don't know what garbage smells like in 95-degree heat and 96% humidity, no air conditioning, so it impacts learning. So it's not just an environmental issue, a health issue, it's also an educational issue. And so when I was doing this study in 1979 and got it published in 1983, and along the way, there was this other struggle that was taking place in Warren County, North Carolina. People contacted me, and we started to collaborate, we started to work together. This is a PCB landfill that was put in this middle of this black community. They used the best science to locate it. They found North Carolina has 100 counties. And it just so happened that they found one of the poorest and one of the blackest counties in North Carolina to put it. It was the best place to put it. That's what was told. At the time, you know, that this landfill was in the middle of the media. You can see these young students, you know, that have put their lives in front of these trucks. And you can see the North Carolina state troopers that are keeping the kids away and trying to keep order. You know, this is a photograph that was taken in 1983, and I said, this is such a great photograph, this should be on a book. And that photograph was on Dumping in Dixie. I went back there 21 years later to find out what happened, and it took 21 years for the state of North Carolina to clean up the mess that it created. It was a state dump. And every study, every scientific analysis said that that facility would leak. And it did leak. And it did contaminate the groundwater. And North Carolina came back later on and detoxified. They didn't make it whole. They did spend $18 million. But the fact is that that particular dump created economic hell for that county. This county still does not have a hospital. People have to drive 15, 20 miles to get to a hospital. And so it cannot attract any industry. It is still very poor. And so when we talk about these issues, we talk about race, we talk about toxics, and the relationship, and the studies have you know, come and gone about whether or not it's race or whether or not it's class or whether or not it's a combination of both. But people on the ground will tell you that they don't have running water, they don't have sewers, they don't have roads, they don't have street lights, they don't have sidewalks, they don't have the basic amenities that most communities would take for granted. And then they get landfills, then they get garbage dumps, then they get hazardous waste facilities. And then somebody will ask, well, Is it because you got all these negative things? Or is it because you are the best place to put it based on objective science? And so the idea emerged to say, let's study this. Let's look at this systematically. And so when we talk about the impetus for changing this paradigm, there were so many groups out there wanting help, needing assistance from coast to coast. Native American reservations being dumped on. Latino communities up and down, along the U.S.-Mexican border, in the barrios. Communities in the South, we call dumping in Dixie. And big cities, south side of Chicago, in Harlem, and in other places, Detroit. Same issues. And people will say, well, why is it happening to us all the time, over and over again? Is there a book that the government and industry are reading to say, okay, you deserve to have the landfill? When you open the envelope and the winner is, you're the winner. And so people will say, people are very suspicious. They didn't have any money, any resources to hire people to do studies. That's where environmental justice scholars and researchers and analysts, planners came in. And in 1991, we held the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. We had 1,000 people. We planned it for 500. 1,000 showed up. And anytime you have 1,000 people in Washington, at a summit, you have to have a demonstration. That's just protocol. And so the fact is that we basically designed, developed the meeting, and we developed 17 principles of environmental justice. The first principle is that people must speak for themselves. If you are a grassroots community that's on the fence line, on the front line for toxics, you have a right to sit at the table with government officials and industry to say what happens. And you should not have to have a mouthpiece, a lawyer, or a scientist, or a sociologist, or a professor to speak for you. You should have the information so that you can speak for yourselves. So this whole idea of a summit, this idea of community-based organizing, grassroots, bottom-up, participatory research, community-based research, community-driven research, came out of many struggles that were occurring across the country. And it actually trickled all the way up to the White House. And on February 11, 1994, President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898. And that order basically looks at two basic pieces of legislation: National Environmental Policy Act, 1969, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that talks about equal enforcement of our laws and non-discrimination if federal money is being used. And in that case, there are a few of us that were invited to the White House in February. It was very snowy, very cold, and Clinton signed the executive order in the Oval Office. That's the only time I've ever been in the Oval Office. I haven't been invited back since 1994 for some reason. I don't know why. But the issue of getting the information, getting it right, and having very smart people do the research. And we were able to convince the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences to conduct a study on environmental justice and health. And the National Institute of Medicine, IOM, Institute of Medicine of the National Academy, did a study, did their report, and published it in 1999. They basically found what we found, that there are certain populations, low-income and minority populations, that suffer from environmental health, that suffer from diseases that stem from environmental problems in greater numbers than anybody else. As I said, not rocket science, but all the common sense, as my grandmother would say, is not always so common. But we want to have very smart people from the National Academy saying it, what we're saying, because it's not enough to have Bob Bullock saying it. It's not enough to have Paul Mohai saying it, or other environmental sociologists saying it. We have to have people who are in the National Academy and who have positions that people listen to. Because we know nobody listens to us. There are some communities that's basically on the wrong side of the tracks. We know this. Physically, geographically, spatially located on the wrong side of the track, and they get all the things that other people don't want. Now, if you talk about does fairness matter, if you live on the wrong side of the track, and if you happen to be one of the residents in those areas, fairness does matter. It matters if we are now so focused and so concerned about homeland security and the possibility of a terrorist attack. And bioterrorism is a real threat. And as a matter of fact, people ask, will the government, will health providers, will first responders be fair if there is a major threat? That is not a hypothetical question. That is not a rhetorical question. That's a real, legitimate question. And if measures are taken that involve isolation or quarantine or travel restrictions or locking people up in certain areas, people will ask, are they doing it to us because we are on the wrong side of the track, we are the wrong complexion for protection, or is it because we are expendable, or is it because we have been contaminated and we are being quarantined to keep the disease or the problem isolated? And so when the 2001 anthrax attack occurred in Washington, D.C., there was differential treatment of the senators and their Senate staff, which is mostly white, predominantly white, and the people who work in the post office, Brentwood Post Office. And we know who work in the post office, most places. In D.C., this is mostly black. But there were 2 postal workers that died. And the fact is that the government waited a long time to do what it needed to do in order to isolate the anthrax in the post office, as opposed to acting swiftly for people in political power and the staffs, etc. Night and day treatment. So the question still remains, if bird flu or some other major threat occurs in certain areas, in major cities, major metropolitan areas, will first responders respond in a way that is non-discriminatory, or will they treat all communities the same? Now, when we talk about this whole question of vulnerable population and vulnerable communities and vulnerable chemical plants, all kinds of government studies from GAO, EPA, shows that there are a lot of chemical plants, 15,000 or more, that are still insecure. And that there are lots of plants that offer so much danger that over 1 million people are at risk in the worst case scenarios. And so the people who live fence line in most places across the country, including California, most of the people who live fence line with these chemical plants that pose the greatest risk are working class people, low income people, and people of color. There are also people who are vulnerable in terms of their ability to escape certain disasters. People who do not have cars, people who are sick, people who are elderly, disabled, who are non-drivers. So when we talk about vulnerability and we talk about equity, all those things go into not only just about landfills, but also about something as dangerous as an attack on a chemical plant by a terrorist, and God forbid. We had lots of examples to show that first responders and government has responded very differently depending on which population groups that are evacuated first. 1995 in Bogalusa, Louisiana. Tank car explodes, first responders come in, evacuate the community that are mostly white first. A couple of days later, they evacuate the black people. And people said, no, this is not right. And there are lots of case studies like this. Anderson, Alabama. I'm going to call names because these chemical companies are located in many cases right on top of communities. And the problem is not that communities are getting jobs. In many cases, they don't even get the job. They get pollution. And they also get sick. So when we talk about communities that are fighting environmental injustice, and while in some cases debates rage, is it race or is it class? Well, if PCBs and TCE, if those chemicals are making people sick, and if those people are poor, and if they are Hispanic or African American or Asian or white, when it comes to the chemical doesn't care if it's race or if it's class. The people are just as sick. So when people call